Hi everyone, it's Rachel, and on the comments of my videos I always get so many questions asking if polymer clay can be coloured using paint, and to be honest I've never tried it myself, so I'm not really sure. I have done research and read online that it's not recommended to use acrylic paints because the water in the paint can turn to steam while baking and this causes bubbles in the clay, but then also apparently people are able to avoid this bubbling if they only use small amounts of paints. So what a better time to try it out myself and experiment what happens. I also decided to take this one step further and find out what types of paint can be used to colour polymer clay, so I'll be testing out black, white and coloured acrylic paint, oil-based paint and watercolor paint, both the liquid and the palette versions. And you can watch until the end of this video to see how all the samples turn out. I'm starting off by mixing black acrylic paint into regular white clay. I flattened down the clay and added a blob of the paint to the center before mixing it in with my hands. Now, for some reason I didn't think ahead and realized just how messy this could get, so I ended up with paint all over my fingers. For this sample, I ended up adding extra paint to the clay because the white clay kind of like cancelled out all the black and made it grey instead. I will have to say too that when mixing in acrylic paint, it made the clay more sticky compared to the other types that I try later on, so I had to leave it rest for a bit before I could work with it properly without leaving a ton of fingerprints in the clay. And then here you can see I cleaned my hands off fairly easily using baby wipes, and I use these throughout the video to continue wiping my hands, just if you were wondering. Next up, I thought I would try mixing a few coloured acrylic paints to the white clay. So here I'm adding a small amount of red in hope that it would turn out a pink colour, and as you can see, yes it did. I then thought I would try and add some purple acrylic paint, so I mixed this into normal white polymer clay and it ended up making a really pretty lilac colour. Again, this one was really sticky to handle, and it might be the acrylic paint that does this or just this particular brand I use because the purple is the same brand as the black that I used before. Then as I was experimenting, I kind of thought, well, if we can colour white clay, will it work the other way if I mix white paint into coloured clay? So for this little experiment, I used white acrylic paint and blue polymer clay because I thought it would be an easy colour to see a difference. I flattened the clay down, added a big old blob of the white paint and then began mixing it in. I actually had to repeat this quite a few times to notice a large difference in colour, so a lot of paint was added to this sample. And then here you can see a comparison of the new blue to the original colour. Up next we have the oil paint. So I'm using black oil paint and adding it to regular white clay. Like the others, I started mixing it in, except that this time I instantly regretted it because I could just tell that this was the end of my semi-clean hands. This paint probably mixed in the easiest out of all of the samples that I do in this video, except here you can see that the obvious downside is the really bad staining. I then decided to try out watercolor paints from a palette, so sticking with the theme for comparison, I used black paint and mixed this into some white clay. I firstly added water to the paint and then kind of like dipped and rubbed the clay into the pigment. I found that the colour wasn't very strong, it was more watery than anything, so I did repeat this a few times until I finally got the colour I wanted and the colour you can see here. I did also find that the texture of the clay became very cracked and crumbly, and I'm not exactly sure why this is, but it is just an observation that I made. Then very similar, I wanted to test out the watercolor paint that you get from a tube to see if it would have any different effects to the one from the palette. So you can actually see here as I pour it onto the clay that it's definitely water based because it has that kind of look when something's waterproof, if you know what I mean. I did have to go back and add some more to the clay because it was quite diluted and the colour wasn't very strong at all. And then something else I found interesting was, unlike the watercolour paint in the palette, this one seemed to hold its shape just like normal and didn't crack or crumble at all. So with all of these test mixtures that I made 2 samples for each, one ball of the clay and then one thinner sample. I placed these on my baking tray and then baked them in the oven as I normally would. And then here are the results after baking. You'll also notice here that I resorted to painting my nails to try and cover up the staining from the oil paint, which was so lovely that it stuck under my nails for over a week. So anyway, this is the first one I made by mixing the black acrylic paint into white clay. The little ball seemed pretty good with no noticeable changes, but the thin sample did bubble in the center just very slightly, but nothing too drastic. Here we have the coloured samples that were made using the acrylic paint. Again, both the pink and the purple balls of clay look just fine. The thin pink sample did show just a few very small bubbles on the surface of the clay, while the purple had a much bigger one coming up from the centre of the clay, and this is likely because I only added a small amount of red paint, whereas I mixed more of the purple, meaning that it had more water mixed into it. Then here we have the blue made by mixing white paint into a darker blue clay. Now this one definitely changed the most. I'm not sure if you can see it on the screen very well, but the colour turned out looking very grainy. And then in the thinner sample, I got a huge bubble in the centre, which made it puff right out, and I can actually like squeeze it and it moves. I'm going to say that both of these factors are due to mixing in such a large amount of acrylic paint into the clay, showing that the research I did at the start of this video was right, and the more that you add, the more you will notice the changes. I then have my friend the oil paint sample, which does actually look quite promising. There are no noticeable bubbles or bulging that I can see, and the only thing that separates it from regular black polymer clay is that it has a slight shine to it after baking, most likely due to the extra oil. The other thing I did observe with this sample is that after baking it's actually quite flexible and bendy, which I found very interesting, and I'm also going to say that this is due to the oil. Next I have the watercolor paint from the tube, and this one isn't too bad. No changes that I can see in the ball of clay, but there is the slightest bubble in the center of the thin sample due to the paint being water-based and therefore creating steam in the oven as it baked. And then finally we have the clay, which was coloured using the watercolour paint from the palette. The ball of clay just looks normal, but in the sample there is a fairly significant bulge in the centre due to the amount of water added to get a dark or vibrant colour. And there you have it. It is possible to colour polymer clay using different types of paint. After doing this little experiment and comparing all of the results, I have to declare that the winner, much to the dislike of my poor stained little hands, is actually the oil paint. Now, I'm not a scientist or anything, but I am going to guess that this one worked out perfectly with no air bubbles or changes through the baking process, because like polymer clay, oil paint is not water-based, it's oil-based, which means that during the baking process, it doesn't bubble because there's no water in the mixture. The only thing I will recommend if you decide to colour clay this way and use oil paint, which had the best results, is definitely use a pair of gloves. So thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more polymer clay videos and crafty videos, and I'll see you next time. Bye guys!